This is part 65 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to check if username exists in database using ASP.NET Web Service and jQuery Ajax. Here is what we want to achieve. As we start to type in this username text box, and when the number of characters in the username is equal to or greater than 3, then we want to issue an Ajax call to check in the database table if that username is already in use. If the username is already taken, then we want to display a message stating username already in use. If the username is not yet taken, then we want to display a message stating username available. So let's see how to achieve this using ASP.NET Web Services and jQuery Ajax. So the first step here is to create the database table, which I have already done. So here is the create table script. The name of the table is TBL registration. This table has got two columns, ID and username. I've also inserted two usernames, Pamela and Sarah Baker. So at the moment within this table TBL registration, we've got two usernames. So the next step here is to create a stored procedure that's going to return 1 if the username exists, otherwise 0. So 1 for true and 0 for false. So let's go ahead and create that stored procedure. Create procedure. Let's call this sp username exists. And we want to pass the username that we want to check as a parameter. And the data type of this is going to be envar of 100 characters as begin and end. And here within the body I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to name it count. In a bit you'll understand the purpose of this variable. Now I'm going to issue a select query. Select count of ID from TBL registration is the name of the table, where username equals at username. Okay, and I'm actually going to store that count in this variable at count. So I'm going to say select at count equals count of ID from TBL registration, where username equals at username. And if at count is greater than 0, what does that mean? That means the username already exists in the database. It's already in use. In that case, we want to return true. So let's go ahead and select 1 and let's give this a column name. Let's actually call this as username exists. Okay? Else, if the count is not greater than 0, then we know that the username does not exist. So in that case, let's select 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the stored procedure. Now in the database table we have a username called Pamela. So let's go ahead and pass this to the stored procedure. So what should this stored procedure do? It should return true. The username exists, that is 1. Let's see if that's what we get. Look at that, username exists, we get 1. On the other hand, we don't have a user called Pamela A. So when we execute this, we should get 0, indicating that the username does not exist. Alright, now let's go ahead and create an ASP.NET Web Service which is going to call this stored procedure. So let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have an empty ASP.NET Web Application project. In the web.config file, I have already included a connection string to our sample DB database, which has got that table, TBL registration. And to this project, let's go ahead and add a web service. And let's call this web service registration service. And we want this web service to be called from script. So I'm going to uncomment this attribute system.web.script.services.script service. And this method is not going to return anything. And I'm going to call this function username exists. And what is this function going to do? It's going to call our stored procedure. Okay, so now we need to write some ADO.NET code. So we need to bring in some ADO.NET namespaces. So we need system.data we need system.data.sql client, and we need system.configuration. So let's go ahead and read the connection string from web.config file. So within our web method, I'm going to create a variable, and let's use the configuration manager class and read the connection string. So the name of the connection string in web.config is dbcs. We want the connection string. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a SQL connection object. SQL connection con equals new SQL connection, and let's pass our connection string. So let's go ahead and create a SQL command object. SQL command equals new SQL command, and what we want to do is actually execute the stored procedure sp username exists. So let's go ahead and pass the name of the stored procedure, and we want to execute this command using the connection object that we have just created. And since this is a stored procedure, we have to specify that using the command type property, and this stored procedure has got a parameter username at username, so we need to pass that parameter to the stored procedure. So let's go ahead and associate a parameter to the command object. So command.parameters.add, and I'm going to add a new SQL parameter object, and we need to populate two properties, parameter name and the value. So parameter name equals the name of the parameter is at username, and value equals, so where is the username going to come for this method? We are going to pass the username from our HTML page to this web method in the form of a parameter. So I'm going to call this username. Okay, so let's pass this as the value. Alright, so we associated the parameter with the command object. Now let's go ahead and open the connection, and let's execute the command. So what value are we expecting? We're expecting a single value from the stored procedure, either 0 or 1, right? So command.execute, I'm going to use scalar method, execute scalar. And what does this method returns? It returns an object, but we know that we are expecting a boolean, so we can safely convert whatever result we get back to a boolean, 1 to true, 0 to false, because that's what the stored procedure is going to return. So now to store our result, I'm actually going to create a variable here. So let's call it username in use, and let's initialize that to false. And I'm going to populate this variable with the result that we are going to get after executing the stored procedure. But what does this function return? It returns an object. We want to convert this to a boolean, so I'm going to use the convert class and convert that to boolean. Alright. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually we want to return two things back to the script which is going to call this a web service method. Actually, I'm going to add a class. In a bit you'll understand the purpose of this class. So let's go ahead and add a class. Let's name this registration.cs. Okay, and this class is actually going to contain two properties, two public properties. So the first one is going to be of type string, and that's going to be username. And let's have the default get and set accessors. And the other property is going to be username in use. So this property is going to be boolean. It returns true if the username is in use, otherwise false. So what I'm going to do is make this the return type from this web service. So we're going to return an object of this type which will contain username and whether if the username is in use or not. Alright, so here I'm actually going to create an instance of that class registration. Let's call the object registration equals new registration, and registration dot username equals whatever username this method is receiving as a parameter, and registration object dot username in use, the value of this is going to be whatever we get back from the database. And what do we want to do with this object? We want to serialize that to JSON and then write it to the response stream. So I'm going to use JavaScript serializer class. And where is that class present? That is present in system.web.script.serialization namespace. So the name of the class is JavaScript serializer. Let's call it JS equals new JavaScript serializer, and this object has got serialize function. To this we are going to pass our registration object. And what do we want to do with that serialized string? We want to write it to the current response stream. So context.response.write whatever JSON string that we get back. So pretty straightforward web service method here. So let's go ahead and build the solution, and let's view this web service in the browser. So at the moment we should be able to invoke this web service and get a JSON string back, and that JSON string should contain two properties: the username and whether if that username is in use or not. If you look at this table, this user Pamela is already in use. So let's copy that username and paste it right here, and let's invoke the web service. Look at that, username is Pamela and that username in use is true. On the other hand, if we try to pass, let's say, Pamela A, which does not exist, Pamela A, username in use, false. Okay, so we have the web service ready. Now let's go ahead and add an HTML page. I have in fact already added the HTML page, and I have also included the HTML to get this UI. So we have that literal text username, a text box. So we have that literal text and a text box, and then a div element to display the result, that is whether the username is in use or not. And all of this is present in a table. I'll have all this HTML and code available on my blog in case you need it. Alright, so within our script section we have the ready function wired up. So now when should all this happen? This should happen whenever we start to type within the text box and when the number of characters is greater than or equal to 3. So we want to make use of the key up event of this text box. So let's go ahead and find this text box. The ID of the text box is txt username. So I'm going to use the jQuery ID selector, find the text box, and I'm going to wire up key up event handler. So when the key up event is raised, we want to execute some code which is going to be part of this anonymous function. So the first thing that we want to do is retrieve the username from this particular text box, and we are already in the context of that text box. So I can use this keyword here to reference the text box, and what we want to do is get the value of that out of that text box. I'm going to store that in a variable. Let's call it username. So whatever value the user typed into the text box, we have that in this variable. Now we don't want to issue ajax call to the database as soon as he starts to type the first character. Instead, let's wait to type at least 3 characters. Let's assume the username should contain at least 3 characters, for example. That's when we should start to check whether if that username exists in the database or not. If in your application, if the username length is 5 or 7, depending on that, at that point you want to issue an ajax call to start checking whether if that username exists. After that, for every character you want to issue an ajax call and check if that username exists. So let's see how to do that now. So if username dot length, if that is greater than or equal to 3, that's when I want to do all the stuff. That's when we want to issue the ajax call. So I'm going to use the ajax function, and we're going to use a JavaScript object and specify the options. So the first thing that we need to specify is the URL. So what is the URL that we want to call? We want to call this registration service.asmx, and within that registration service we've got a function, and the name of that function is username exists. Okay, so we want to call that function. Alright, so that's the URL that we want to call. And how do we want to issue that request? We want to issue a post request. So I'm going to specify that using the method option. And then, this function, that is username exists, expects some data to be passed. So let's go ahead and specify the data. So if you look at the name of the parameter for this method, it's username. So here the name of the parameter is username, and where is the value going to come for that? It's going to come from this variable, and again the name of that variable is also username. Okay, and what is the data type that we are expecting from the server? We are expecting JSON data. So let's go ahead and specify that. And then if the function successfully completes, then we want to associate a callback function, and this function is going to receive the data from the web service. Okay, and finally, if there is an error, again we want a callback function, and whatever error we get back, we want to display that using a JavaScript alert. Alright, so if it is successful, this is the callback function that gets called. So what do we want to do at that point? At that point, we want to display the result within this div element, and this div element has got an ID, div output. So let's go ahead and find that div element. So within this success function, I'm going to create a variable. Let's call this div element equals dollar. Let's use the ID selector. Okay, now, so this object, this is a JSON object, and the properties of this object will be very similar to the properties of the object that we are returning here. So this registration object that we are returning, it is actually having two properties, username and username in use, right? And this username in use is a Boolean property, true or false. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to check if data dot, what is the name of that property? Username in use. So if data dot username in use, that's a Boolean property by itself. If it returns true, then what we want to do is within this div element, we want to use the text function and say username, whatever username we have typed into the text box is already in use. Okay, and at that point, let's set the color of the div element to red. The font color, let's do that using CSS function. So color is red. Alright, else if this property returns false, then we know that username is available. In that case, to the div element, we want to associate a different text. So username is available. Okay, and let's change the color in that case to green. Alright, so that's all there to it. Okay, so let's go ahead, save all these changes and reload our HTML page 1. And look at this, as we start typing, look at that, as soon as we start, type the third character, and it calls the web service and it says spam is available. And look at that, every time we type a character, it says that's available. But remember, Pamela username is already taken. And look at this, the moment I type A, it says Pamela is already in use. Now if I type another character like Pamela 1, for example, it says Pamela 1 is available. So here is the stored procedure, here is the web service code, and here is the jQuery code and HTML. Thank you for listening and have a great day.